Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We're all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
Many Christmases, I went to get a doll for my son. I reached for the last one they had, but so did another man. As I rained blows upon him, I realized there had to be another way. But out of that, a new holiday was born. A Festivus for the rest of us. Hey, everybody. For our final episode of 2023 and our holiday episode this year, we are talking about the Festivus episode of Seinfeld. Everybody get excited.
Yay!
Seinfeld is one of mine and Hannah's favorite shows. It's definitely my favorite sitcom. I don't know if it's your favorite sitcom, Hannah.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah. It's a show I watch all the time. Hannah watches all the time. We quote constantly to each other. I communicate 50% through Seinfeld gifts that I send to her via text message. So we were really excited to shove a Seinfeld episode into a season of Popcorn Psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you guys know, we don't do a lot of TV because it's just so much content, especially a show like Seinfeld where there are 9 seasons. But this show, well, this episode specifically, is such a particular topic. Well, one, it's a holiday topic, which we love. And then Festivus is something that has almost transcended Seinfeld into its own thing. A fun piece of trivia up top is that a writer on Seinfeld, this is actually inspired from his real life, and that his father created Festivus and made them celebrate it as kids. So believe it or not, this is a true story.
Yeah. Dark.
Very dark indeed. So for anyone who isn't aware, I don't know how you can enjoy this episode without watching Seinfeld and Festivus episode, just because the context that we're going to be using throughout. But basically, Festivus is a holiday made up by one of the main characters' fathers, Frank Costanza, in a response to the hyper-consumerism of like Black Friday, Uber buying stuff. It kind of actually connects to our other holiday episode this year, Jingle All the Way, which is also about a hot toy that people fight maliciously over.
Although, unlike Jingle All the Way, this is an effective satire.
Yes. Well, in a lot of ways, Seinfeld is a satire throughout.
Yeah.
And so basically, Festivus, the basic conceit of it is that it's on December 23rd. And then instead of a tree, you have a metal pole. And instead of, I don't know, playing board games and loving each other, you participate in several trials, basically designed to humiliate. So one is the feats of strength, which is basically wrestling for dominance. And then the other one is
the airing of grievances.
The airing of grievances, which, how does that go, Hannah?
That is when you say all the things that you dislike about the people in your family.
And how does Frank put it?
I got a lot of problems with you people, and you're going to hear about it.
Yeah.
And then he trips up in his first example of what that is.
Yeah, he just
but only after first attacking George's boss.
Ugh. Yeah.
In front of George.
What we're going to be talking about today is trauma.
Great.
So that kind of leads into that trauma, specifically trauma for George Costanza, the son of Frank.
Yes.
And then Festivus as a holiday that really caters to someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, which is a hot topic right now, NPD.
It's a hot topic amongst the internet who likes to diagnose everybody with it.
So firstly, I mean, it feels fitting that the last episode of the season, we talk about trauma, the unofficial mascot of our show.
Yes.
And why we wanted to talk about it is this episode is actually one of the most textbook examples of someone having a trauma reaction in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to try really hard, Hannah too, to not pull in every single episode of Seinfeld we ever watched while talking about this episode. But anyone who's watched Seinfeld can discern that the Costanzas are not
unwell.
the warmest kindest people. Or as Hannah put it, unwell. It's a family that does a lot of yelling, does a lot of arguing, does a lot of belittling, does a lot of emotional abuse. It's kind of the currency within the family. And specifically in this episode, though, what came to me first when I wanted to talk about trauma was George's reaction to even Festivus coming up. So where we see it first in this episode is that he is talking to, I think, Elaine and Jerry at the deli. And does Jerry starts to bring up the idea of Festivus. And then what do we see happen with George?
He gets flustered. He asks him not to talk about it. As Jerry continues to talk about it, he decides that he can't stay there anymore and gets up and walks out of the coffee shop.
I would argue that he runs away from the coffee shop.
He does run away. He immediately runs away. He gets so activated that he like storms off.
Mm-hmm. And I could definitely see George then spending the next 4 blocks just walking down the street at a hurried gait, mumbling the way he likes to do. Minor yelling. Larry David-esque, which I know is the inspiration for George.
Yes.
But yeah, we see someone who, when we talk about like fight or flight, freeze, fawn, we see a bit of freezing, especially when his dad shows up with the pole later in the episode. But he definitely does a lot of textbook flighting, like fleeing. He cannot abide he can't tolerate any discussion about Festivus from Jerry. And then when, unfortunately, Kramer pulls Frank back in the mix and reintroduces Festivus to the world.
They're all terribly unkind to George with this, especially Kramer. Like, they get curious about it. They're mean to him. They're teasing him. And then Kramer goes straight to the source and seeks out Frank, who says he hasn't celebrated Festivus in years, and then shows up with a 1970s tape recorder.
Oh, I forgot about that till just now.
With an audio recording of him yelling at a quite obviously younger George to read and shaming him for being unable to read without his glasses before starting a wrestling match.
I mean, I think one thing that's true about all the characters of Seinfeld is that they're not particularly kind people. And we're not going to get into what's up with all of them because we're not going to talk about Seinfeld for 9 hours.
Exactly.
But it's something that is a common trait, like you're saying, Ben, is that they're all pretty self-involved. You know, they will go for the joke, even if it damages relationship. Like there's a whole episode where they don't want to get rid of a bit of saying, oh, hello, about a belly button, to the point that Jerry breaks up with his girlfriend to keep the bit. Like they are people that I think the reason why the 4 of them are friends with each other, even though they don't particularly like each other all the time, because I don't know if anybody else would be friends with them.
Yeah.
They kind of have a group of acquaintances, but they don't really have any other tight friends besides the 4 of them. And Jerry and George grew up together. So they also have the ease of history where they probably just continue to stay friends because they've always been friends. And because I feel like Jerry is a comedian, would keep a friend around who is just like a ongoing folder of bits, which you could argue that's what George is, and that's what the Costanzas are.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's no real thought process by anybody on the show about taking George's trauma seriously because none of them take each other seriously.
They don't take anybody's pain seriously. They are 100% out for their own gain or perspective at all times. And it is, makes for a hilarious show, but it's definitely a very, very unkind thing to do if someone starts expressing strong reactions about their family of origin, to force them to dig into it and then reactivate all of the old stuff by seeking out the source itself. And it's not like that's an foreign thing for people to do. Sometimes people will seek out the source, and that is a tragic mistake.
Mm-hmm. Or just not taking people's trauma seriously. I think that's very common. I think when we see people who are bucking nowadays about like wokeness and shit like that, it's because they want to be able to tease the way that Jerry and them tease each other, which is I don't want to have to take anything you're going through seriously. And so it doesn't occur to them that even when George runs off in distress, that I don't think anyone felt bad. I don't think Jerry was ruminating on that after the fact.
They were laughing.
They were laughing.
And they were laughing when he ran out.
Yeah. And then when Frank shows up later with the pole at their safe space, like I would argue that the coffee spot is George's safe space or one of his safe spaces. He shows up.
Certainly away from his parents.
Oh, yeah. Because aren't they in like Queens?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's kind of his distance there from them. But to show up in a public place, dragging that pole, making a scene in front of his friends as an adult, playing a taped recording of a previous humiliation as if it's no big deal. And then you see, George have his trauma reaction again, where he kind of regresses and then he literally runs off.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, George is quite obviously mortified at this.
Mm-hmm.
He's showing every sign of someone who is avoiding and shutting down and getting agitated, aggravated, anxious. And then he reaches a point where he's quite obviously dissociating, which is when he's sitting at the table. He is obviously finding his shutdown part because he has to sit in with his boss.
Oh, the dinner later?
The dinner. Yes, he has to sit next to his boss as his father goes into this complete diatribe of releasing all of George's private thoughts about work right at the boss.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that says also so much about, well, I'm going to get ahead of myself. But one, I think what's also interesting about George's presentation is how he seems younger too. And I think that's something that's so true when you've gone through trauma is you can regress in the moment, but also you can kind of have a bit of arrested development, which I think is true for George. He never really grows up maturity wise and impulse control wise and things like that. And I think a classic example of that is bringing his boss to this dinner, not even thinking about that he is exposing himself and his boss to information and behaviors that actually won't benefit his goal, which is just to get out of trouble.
No, he had
which
to.
Which to me is so young. He
had to.
He had to because he lied about the human fund. Yeah. And he had to show him that it was because of this Festivus that he doesn't really celebrate Christmas.
Yeah.
That he celebrates Festivus. But I think he knows exactly what he's getting his boss into. And I think he knows that there's nothing else that can be done.
Which is why he's dissociating. Dissociation exists for us to survive between a rock and a hard place. Does George present young often? Yes, but this isn't one of those times where he's dealing with like bad decision making. George is in a bad situation because yet again, George made a horrible decision, and damn if those consequences don't come around. Murphy's Law is a bitch around the holidays, folks. Every lie you decide to tell has a way of coming back on you. Was he presenting young and like Jerry even looking at him like he's being absurd that he didn't get an equal value Christmas gift back from somebody. So George then decides to make up his own charity so he doesn't have to pay other people money and just collect gifts. And once the boss catches him, George had no escape.
Yeah.
And just the short-sightedness.
That's what I think that's what I meant more, like the short-sightedness
the
of like
short-sightedness of also of coming up with the most basic name. Like he couldn't do like he couldn't even say Human Foundation, which sounds more legit than the Human Fund. Like he had the stupidity of making one up that sounds so obvious.
Yeah.
And then And doing it just so he doesn't have to buy gifts for everyone.
That he can profit off his gift ratio this year, as opposed to giving somebody Yankees tickets and getting back a donation.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think we also see this regression in that because Frank tries to wrestle. Who does Frank try to wrestle first? Kramer? Kramer. But then Kramer's like, no thanks, which is also so selfish, right? That Kramer digs up this big traumatic thing for George. And then he immediately loses interest and like leaves George to suffer, literally. Because doesn't George say, like, when Kramer says no thanks, well, who's going to do the feats of strength? As if George knows that it'll be him.
No, the boss suggests George.
Oh.
I think it should be George.
Which is very true. And I think what feels interesting is I don't get the vibe from George that he thinks he could fight against that. Or like that, like if his dad decides he's going to do the feats of strength, he's going to have to do the feats of strength with his dad. And I think that says also a lot about how we can regress when we are around the person who traumatized us as a kid and who like also continues to perpetuate those abusive behaviors on us, which is we see with all the scenes with Frank and George, that Frank does not stop now that George is an adult. There's still a lot of like humiliation and emotional abuse and stuff and yelling. And so the fact that at no point do we see, like, I don't think we would have seen George say, I'm not interested in wrestling you. I feel like George would have begrudgingly taken his suit jacket off and wrestled his dad in front of his boss. Yeah. Which I think also says so much when people from the outside look in on like traumatic family systems. A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, why don't they just leave? Why do they put up with that? Why do they just let that happen? So I think it's important to just point out that if you've gone through trauma, especially as a kid, and if you're still in touch with and seeing the people who abused you or perpetuated the abuse upon you, you can very easily still fall into those patterns of behavior. And that part of that is kind of what you were bringing up earlier, Ben, which is dissociating, right? Is like falling into the part of you that played that role within your family.
Yes.
So George continuing to be submissive to his dad in a lot of ways makes sense.
Yeah, and George has to fawn here. This is a entire fawning response because George is so screwed that Kruger caught him in a lie. He may have had a different response had he not been actually so stuck. He may not have had to regress into that child part. At dinner with his parents, he may have behaved how he normally does, which is arguably more like a 19-year-old who's visiting home after college, but not like this version of himself where he's kind of like quiet and trying to be invisible.
Yeah, and his like posture too, like curled over, almost trying to like hide his face. Yeah.
But Kruger is making him do this as his penance. Kruger is not unaware of what's going on. This is penance, so Kruger doesn't have to fire him. And it seems to be amusing him that George is actually telling the truth, but the truth that he's telling is still convenient.
Yeah.
He would never have brought up Festivus had it not been for getting caught lying.
Oh, yeah. Well, Kruger is like the most apathetic person I've ever seen on screen. So I'm not shocked that he might just be happy of the thrill of it all. Because he seems like someone who's so bored of his life that this probably is the most exciting thing that's happened to him in a while.
Maybe.
Yeah. And
Kruger
so
hates everything.
Yeah. And he's very whatever about literally everything.
But watching that response from George, I think you see just a range of the responses. What we don't see is any evidence of intrusive thoughts or memories. But once they get triggered, his reactions are severe.
Oh, yeah. He can't tolerate it at all. Well, at least in the first two situations, he can't tolerate it so much that he flees. And then when he's in a situation where the consequences don't allow, or the situation doesn't allow fleeing, yeah, he fawns, which we've talked about as if you feel like you can't fight or flight, you will fawn or freeze. And so we see more of that from him. But yeah, it was a really... I'm sure very unintentional on the Seinfeld writers to create such a perfect example and succinct example of trauma responses. So we'll take a break here and be right back. So Festivus as the holiday of someone with narcissistic personality disorder, which I'm going to go on a limb and say Frank Costanza has. Even though everybody in the show, like we've talked about many times with other things, everyone on the show is a cartoon, pretty much. So we have to keep that in mind when thinking about potential diagnoses. So why are we thinking NPD for Frank? What are we seeing that feels truly narcissistic, not armchair psychologist narcissistic?
Frank has no regard for other people's feelings, situations, only how they reflect upon him. Especially with how he views George. When he views George as a disappointment and a poor reflection upon him, he gets abusive quickly.
Yeah, even that video, that tape that he plays, the recording of the past Festivus, getting mad at your son for needing glasses feels very on the NPD spectrum, because what he's really mad at is he is a son that has weak eyes and therefore is weak. And that is an insult upon him, a man who does not need glasses, has perfect eagle eyes, is probably how he would describe himself if he had to. Yes.
But Frank always describes himself as being the best without any evidence, right?
Yeah.
That's a critical component of, they usually demand to have adoration or adulations dumped upon them without necessarily anything to back them up other than their own thought process. Like, I'm the best, therefore you should treat me like I'm the best. And they have no tolerance for any countering information.
Yeah.
And tend to get angry and spiteful when presented with such.
Yeah.
Kind of like Gaston.
Yeah. Ew. To compare the two.
Exactly.
Which, now that we're talking about it, it starts to make more sense to me why Kramer and Frank end up as a duo a lot of the times, because Kramer does treat Frank with a lot of that adulation. Like, every bonkers idea Frank has come up with, Kramer gets invested in, like the bro's ear or whatever they call it. What do they call it? The man's ear or the bro?
The bro.
The bro. Not the man's ear. And like the Festivus thing, like Kramer will go to Frank and really pump him up. Like, even like with this one, with the Festivus, he's like, wow, you're a genius, Frank. You always have such good ideas, which also makes sense then why Frank will drop everything and go to Kramer's bagel shop to talk to him about Festivus. Even though I don't think he would necessarily do that for George. I think Kramer is more what Frank would want out of George, which is a son who acts like his shit doesn't stink.
Well, that's what Kramer does eternally, is he just validates every idea and like plays up to it. He's a crony.
Yeah.
To Frank, basically. He's like everybody's cheerleader and thinks every idea will work. And Frank, being so narcissistic that he can't possibly fathom any universe where his ideas don't work, drinks it up.
Yeah.
And then it fuels him to launch into whatever bad idea full force. Whereas Kramer will lose interest and get himself involved in the next most ridiculous thing that comes across his way, because he's entirely scattered and impulsive.
The idea of putting Kramer on some Adderall, you know what I mean? Just getting that brain focused. I mean, he'd probably lose all of his sparkle, but at what cost? Well, even thinking about the origin of Festivus, right? That Frank is telling a story about how he gets into a physical altercation because he lets his feelings overwhelm him, and he engages in pretty shitty behavior. And instead of being introspective about that and taking any ownership of the fact that he would beat the shit out of another person for a doll, he decides I'm not the one that's wrong. It's the entire holiday of Christmas and everything about it. And I'm going to start a whole new holiday, and I get to decide every aspect of it and suck all the joy out of it simultaneously, with no regard about how that would make his tiny son feel. Because George must be pretty little at that time.
He's young enough to want a doll.
Yeah. And so he
Although with
decides
George, who knows?
to he basically steals Christmas from George and replaces it, like I said, with a holiday that is totally based on humiliation and centering Frank.
Mhm.
Because even in the Festivus celebration we see at the second half of the episode, I don't hear anybody else getting to air grievances or to do feats of strength. Like, the feeling I was getting, because we only get brief snippets of what it's like, is that Frank gets to use this holiday, gets to weaponize it to verbally humiliate George and probably Estelle as well. And then to physically dominate them. And is there anything more narcissistic than an adult man who is so threatened by his son, by his child, that he feels the need to physically dominate him on a holiday? So you're not just taking away Christmas, but you're replacing it with this?
Yeah.
Well, the only way he can accept his son as a man is if his son can prove that he is better.
But if he proves that he's better, Frank will lose his mind.
Yeah.
Which is the narcissistic trap.
Of course. Frank knows he can't. So therefore, he gets to maintain his dominance by proposing a feat of strength that George is not going to win.
And the fact that he records the airing of grievances and has held on to them for, it's got to be 20, 25 years.
At least.
Is so foul. Like, that's probably one of the darker things about this episode.
He keeps proof of his abuse.
And then it makes me curious, like, what does he use those tapes for? Does he bring them out on random situations in which he wants to further humiliate George and, like, put him in his place? Are there ones for Estelle as well that he also utilizes? Like, that's so grim to think that he just collects these things. For what purpose other than to furtherly abuse and humiliate?
Trophies, Brittany, trophies.
It's so dark.
Yeah.
And I really bet that they don't get to do airing of grievances onto him.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't.
It really feels like Frank just stands up at the end of the table and goes around the table.
That's the holiday.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody else remotely gets a chance. And I think George will just seek to escape as soon as the abuse is done, as soon as the verbal abuse, and then he seeks to run away. And Estelle probably just yells at him.
She probably yells, "Stop it, you're making George feel bad." She probably just does that for like 20 minutes, but that doesn't really do anything to like actually get George out of that situation, because they don't have to participate. They don't have to sit down on the 23rd, and or Estelle doesn't. But I mean, this is like, they must have gotten married in like the 60s. You know what I mean? Like, they're of a time in which someone like Estelle probably, that's not an option to think
probably
that they could.
50s. George and Jerry would have been born in the 60s.
That's true.
At least.
Yeah, no, that's correct. That comes up in a high school episode.
Oh, yeah. Hannah's our resident Seinfeld expert. I mean, I will say we do see Estelle try to be assertive. Like I said, like, she does yell, and every once in a while she quote unquote stands up for George by trying to sort of get between him and Frank. But then it just evolves into a huge screaming match that either, like you said earlier, Ben, George participates in, or he shuts down, or he leaves.
Or he tries to get away from.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think the strongest reaction from him, honestly, comes when, like, he hears the sound of that pole being dragged on the ground.
Yeah.
That is haunting. Like, that's probably, he probably has nightmares.
Oh, you know, the sound guy, like, the sound guy added a sound to that he found of, like, absolutely just, like, dragging a metal pole across, like, a blacktop, which carries, like, its own traumatic impressions by itself. But that, like, watching George's entire body freeze and go, no, is that not the Festivus full, please?
So where I will insert some, I don't know if I want to say empathy with Frank, or just to put some understanding under this, is like, when you have NPD genuinely, you really struggle with empathy because you are so, like, chronically self-centered. And so Frank it would be really hard for Frank to tap in to the empathetic part of him that really understands what he's doing instead of how what he's doing feeds him and his ego and his insecure sense of self.
Tremendously. And then Estelle in this episode at least is showing herself to be pretty dependent. So there's no valuation of George strong enough with anything that will shift Frank's mindset away.
Yeah.
And then the downside of all of the people being there, including the extraneous people that Kramer brings to this dinner, is that Frank now has an audience. So there's absolutely zero chance that he's going to imply or deploy any empathic parts for George or perceive anything, because now George's shameful reaction is embarrassing him because George is now showing himself as a weak man.
And this glasses. Is also, and this is also where like the lack of emotional intelligence comes in on Frank's part, which is not understanding how his then reaction to George's behavior is the culprit of that behavior. That you're not building him out of this hole by humiliating him, by shaming him publicly in front of all of his friends and these strangers and his boss. That there's no part of his dad, of Frank, that is taking into consideration, oh, my son's boss is here, I should be on my best behavior, or I shouldn't jeopardize my son's job. And instead he goes right to jeopardizing. I mean, like what he does with Kruger, like that could very easily destroy George's career at that company.
I mean, what a career is it though, really?
Well, I know,
like,
but you know,
George has a new career every episode. But yeah, I know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that Frank thinks about anybody besides himself. I don't think that he has any awareness or any need to think about anyone besides himself. And I think that, and he's shown in the show over time to be a very solitary character. Like we don't ever see him and Estelle with friends. We don't ever see them happy together, even, I would really say, when they're out and about. And that he just doesn't think about anybody else but himself.
Yeah, because they try to make friends with the Seinfelds, and that's a whole plot point, right? Is the Seinfelds not liking them. And they must have known the Seinfelds for like 30 years if their kids have been friends since elementary school.
Yeah.
Like they've known the Seinfelds forever. And it's not until their kids are in their 30s that they're like, do they not like us? And then being mad about it, right?
Yes.
And then they move to Del Boca Vista. And then that's a shit show.
Just to prove that the Seinfelds are not better than them.
Yeah. So it continues to be like, you're totally right in that they don't have any friends. And when you see them try to make friends, it devolves super quickly because someone like Frank can't get out of their own way.
Yeah.
And then because a lot of marriages from that time, especially in healthy ones like Frank and Estelle's, that you get kind of enmeshed too, that Estelle kind of just goes along with whatever Frank's doing, even though she's screaming her opposition the whole time.
Yes.
I don't think she says anything in the episode besides the taped version of her yelling and then dinner's ready. I don't think she says anything else.
Yeah.
She's completely dependent on Frank's reactions. And it's really sad for George, frankly. But also looking at who George has surrounded himself with, this entire episode, Elaine's entire subplot is that she's using this dude.
She's got to get that sub card.
Get her
She's
sub
eaten 23
card.
bad subs, okay? She needs that free sub. Or what was it all for?
I want that free sub.
And she has
Captain Hats involved?
Right? No concern whatsoever that this like dude's feelings may be hurt, that she gave him a fake number and goes through all this rigmarole just to get that free sub.
And I mean, and also like his best friend is Jerry, someone who dehumanizes every woman he dates to a trait, right? And even the way he talks about the girl he's currently dating is abhorrent.
Yeah.
I mean, he literally refers to her as a Batman villain.
Good job, Ben.
There you go.
I mean, they bring it up.
They do bring it up.
I mean, good job for remembering.
Or maybe it's George. I think it's George that says that.
Yeah, he says that, and then
She's a
Jerry
two-face.
says, if that helps you.
Right. But Jerry is also incredibly narcissistic and looks at especially the women he dates as objects and is always evaluating them, always basing how they make him look, basically.
How
if
they
he's
make
with
him
them.
look, how they make him feel, what he can get out of them. Like having sex with that Russian gymnast just to see if that makes the sex better, and then bemoaning that he has to keep dating her because he'll look like a creep if he doesn't, not knowing that woman's name that he dates. I mean, we could go on and on.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah. The amount of narcissism in this show
It's a lot.
It's unqualifiable other than to say it's every minute of every episode
Yeah.
with every character.
And that's why I think they're like
Except Kramer, maybe.
Their child, if you will, the Seinfeld's child is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is also a show of 4 people, 5 if you include Danny DeVito, also named Frank, who are just also totally narcissistic, total users. Everything, goes back to them, including how they treat each other. So anything else you want to say about that before we go to a break?
Nope.
All right, cool. Okay, so the final thing we wanted to talk about is George Costanza and personality disorders. So one thing I wanted to highlight that I don't think a lot of people who are doing these sort of informal diagnosing on the internet is that a lot of people who have personality disorders, it comes out of having really bad trauma or just trauma in general. There's not a lot of people who have personality disorders who have not experienced trauma. And I just want to say that because a lot of the way that narcissistic personality is talked about now and how borderline has definitely been talked about is as if you're like a bad seed, that you're just born as this like huge evil monster dickhead.
Yep.
And just a bad person. And the reason why you aren't diagnosed until you're 18 is 1, a lot of these traits are stuff you exhibit as a kid developmentally. And then also 2, because a lot of it is like nurture, like things you experienced growing up. And also, if you are raised by a parent who has a personality disorder, you are also more inclined to develop a personality disorder because it's kind of a combination of nature and nurture, genetic predisposition, and also a lot of learned behaviors. Yes. So I think George is kind of a classic example of someone who has potentially their own personality disorder, but definitely personality disorder tendencies. And when you work with someone like George, it's good to piece out how much of this is related to their trauma, how much of this is genuine a personality disorder diagnosis, and how much of it is learned behavior from their family, and how much of it is all 3. Yeah. And Frank and George is all 3. Because as we've talked about, I mean, I'm sure you could list this off, Hannah. How many behaviors does George demonstrate that are personality disorder behaviors that is a direct reflection of his parents and what they've modeled?
All of them. All of them. Yeah. I mean, it would be impossible for it not to be for him, because a lot of what we talk about a lot of what I talk with clients about is how while your growing up may not be the source of all of your problems, it certainly has a hell of an impact, considering it's the first definitely contributing factor to being in a household with people for the first 18 years of your life, at least.
There was discussion of removing borderline personality disorder from the last DSM.
Oh.
And replacing it with some kind of reaction to prolonged trauma.
Interesting.
Because it has been shown in research it almost never exists without chronic trauma.
Yeah.
So people need to stop saying everybody's ex-boyfriend, everybody's ex-girlfriend, everybody's ex whatever, everybody's parent is narcissistic or borderline or histrionic, and assigning some kind of issue to them that isn't necessarily reflective of the reality that they lived. It's just everybody's an asshole and somebody hurt me, so they must be this. And it's unfair to assign all those things without taking into account what that person's life might have been like. Because even as we see this, like, this show pokes fun at it.
Yeah.
This show makes it funny for us to kind of relive caricatures of our parents. And it's funny because it's true that people's family members can be like this. But recognizing how careless people are being with these languages that are just mad that they got hurt by somebody, which is fair. But assigning that, oftentimes a teenage or college relationship may have been a narcissistic personality disorder is a bit much.
Well, and I guess
psychologically speaking.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to also say is that someone having one of these personality disorders does not excuse them from mistreating other people. So me saying all that and asking people to access more empathy around these diagnoses doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all pass for people of any diagnosis to mistreat, abuse, yada, yada, somebody else. I think it's more like just we have to have a more like well-rounded idea of these diagnoses specifically, and that people who struggle with them are not having a good time. George is not having a good time.
George is miserable.
He's one of the most miserable people, I think, on TV. And he also doesn't seem to quite understand how to get himself out of his misery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because going back to the idea of like how having personality disorder is a combination of like trauma and all these other things. And we talked about this a lot in our Fantastic Mr. Fox episode, which is another episode about like a dad who has these NPD traits and then how it impacts his child. Is when you have a parent who's narcissistic, like we've talked about, every road goes back to them, including their children. So when you are someone like George, you are not raised and nurtured to have a strong sense of self.
Yeah.
Because that's not your purpose. Your purpose is to be one of your dad's limbs, or maybe a trophy he can wear around his neck. Right? You are not encouraged or nurtured to be a independent, thriving, confident person. That's not your function for a parent who struggles with narcissistic traits. So it makes sense then that you would grow up and you're way more likely to have a personality disorder, because a central factor of especially cluster B personality disorders is having a really difficult time finding a sense of self, if you have one at all. And I think something that's really true if you watch all of Seinfeld is that George does not know who George is.
Definitely
he spends
not.
the whole show trying on versions of George and seeing if they fit. Even him like getting engaged to Susan is him doing that because he thinks Jerry's going to do it. Right? Wasn't that part of it? Is they both thought they were going to get married at the same time?
Absolutely.
So he doesn't even do it because it's something he wants. And then he just commits to it because he doesn't know how to get out of it.
Although I think that was one of the worst plot lines of the whole show and worst characters.
Susan?
Yeah.
You can't introduce a sane person into that friend group. It's just not going to work because it's not going to make sense.
But no, George, George does not know who George is at all.
Yeah. He has an whole episode where he tries to be the opposite of George to see if that works. And it does a little bit, kind of. But that's still him like playing a part.
Yes.
Not actually being himself.
Which people can't do. People try all the time to do that. To maintain a face of, no, I can just be this or I can be that. And like we see with George, unfortunately for anyone who thinks that's a real solution, it is a lot of energy to run a part.
Yeah.
It's a lot of energy to run fractured components, even idealized or acting as if. It's a lot of energy. And it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, you'd have to be casting a concentration spell. And if you get hit with anything or stressed out in the real world, it's going to get harder and harder. And eventually you're going to lose your ability to concentrate on running this fake version of yourself, and the mask will drop.
No, but even like George wearing those hiking boots until he can't pull it off anymore. George wearing that giant hat for a while to try to seem taller. Like George does all these things to try to be a version of himself. And I think that does create like pathological lying. You know what I mean? Like when because he doesn't know who his authentic self is, it makes sense then why he feels comfortable lying. He feels really comfortable bullshitting. Like I could even argue that the human fund is just a byproduct of a person who has been playing pretend his whole life to try to get through life. George is surviving. He's not thriving.
Yeah.
George cannot thrive.
Yeah.
You cannot survive and thrive at the same time.
Yeah.
You can't.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people try to make it seem like the only pathway to success is to hit the point that you have to do it to the level of surviving to thrive. But it doesn't work that way. Those people don't start thriving until they've found ways to make it work. Now, hitting survival till you find motivation to make it work, I'll accept the argument for that. But most of the time, what happens when people try that is they get so stressed out that they fail repeatedly, kind of like our dear friend George here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't stop till they get caught as well.
Well, they kind of like Elaine, you see that the narcissistic component or survival component, depending on which it is, like forces people to feel it's so intolerable to get caught anymore, probably for whatever reason makes it feel unsafe to get caught, that they will go to extreme lengths to maintain the lie and save face rather than come clean with it. Like, look at all of the ridiculous things Elaine does. It's mostly Elaine in this episode that does the ridiculous things, but it varies from episode to episode which character's doing it.
Who's being the most zany.
Right. Elaine, in order to get a free sandwich, is trying to get back a card she gave a fake number to a man on that she callously went into the party knowing she was going to give a fake number to people just because he was wearing a denim vest.
Listen, here's what I will say though. I will say that it makes sense to me as a woman, especially back in those days when men would ask for your number like that you probably had to have a fake number on deck because you can't just not give a man your number. So I don't blame her for giving out a rando number. I will say her determination to get the sub card though is her inability to take an L about the subs.
Yeah.
That's just her being the zany B plot.
Well,
Yeah,
and that's the whole component of personality disorders that's rooted in trauma. That one of the things that is important, like, sure, women have had to have fake numbers and fake contact information for eternity and deserve protection from men's creepy bullshit. But Elaine's strategies for dealing with things are so bananas that they're all rooted in her entertainment and not necessarily her self-protection. And then for her to go seek this man out and go to the lengths that she does, even ignoring like this man at the bagel shop is willing to give her a free sandwich just to stop her pattern of ridiculousness, that she's so determined. She doesn't care if she embarrassed or hurt this man's feelings that she gave a fake number to.
No.
Yeah.
And it's not like he went above and beyond being creepy. He was just like, he was wearing a denim vest, so she decided he was creepy, which may or may not be fair, but
definitely fair.
Denim on denim's rough stuff.
He didn't push her. He just said like, hey, maybe we should go out sometime.
Yeah.
You're not wrong.
And,
no, you're not wrong.
You know, when men get put, like the dudes at the betting track, extremely creepy.
That was scary. That would be a scary. And then the men behind her that are like,
all of
you
that
can also tell that they're
thing.
listening to see what her number is.
Absolutely need a fake number for that situation.
Yeah. I would just give them Jerry's number.
Well, that's fair, but she instead gives them the shop's number, and then just in case he calls the betting place to then call there, like, so she can meet up with him to get her card back.
I mean, it's some real Vandalay industry stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but it's callous disregard for how she may have made this man feel, and then expecting him to just give her what she wants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One thing I did want to make sure to mention, though, with George specifically, is that in my mind, he strikes me more as histrionic. And I did a quick Google to see if my intuitive therapeutic intuition was correct on this. So just for a little psychoeducation. So this is from an article from Very Well Health, just kind of saying the differences between HPD, so histrionic personality disorder, and NPD. Is in histrionic, you will seek attention regardless of type, whereas NPD, it has to be like positive feedback, admiration. I would say something that does feel really true to me about George is he likes attention. I don't think he really cares if it's good attention or bad attention.
Definitely
He does a lot of embarrassing stuff to himself.
Brittany, he was in the pool. Attention. He was in the pool.
He was in the pool.
But even, I can't think of a good example right now, unless you have one, Hannah, but just that he does so many zany things just to get women to like him, to get attention, even if they don't really like him, or even if it embarrasses him or looks bad.
I mean, there's a whole episode about how he can't handle Jerry's girlfriend not liking him, that he becomes obsessed with her and ignores the woman who is clearly into him to pursue a woman who hates his guts.
Yeah.
So I think there's an episode where he plays the bad boy, where he's the bad boy and he plays the bad boy in the situation. There's an episode where he goes up against all the people in the building to get this apartment to say how pathetic his life is. That's where he tells his whole trauma story, his life story of how terrible his life has been.
Yeah.
I mean, the list goes on and on with George. I think I agree that he's histrionic. I think that it's a part for him. I think it's a part of learned behavior. And a part of just a response to growing up in the home that he grew up in. But I want to hear more about what you specifically picked out.
It's only a few things. So willing to be viewed as fragile or dependent to get attention.
Absolutely.
Which we definitely aligns with George. And that's in contradiction to an inflated sense of self. Because I don't think he has that. He would probably be the first person to say that he is like a piece of garbage.
He definitely would.
Yeah. So that's where he feels more histrionic to me. Also displays rapidly shifting and shallow expressions of emotion.
Absolutely.
Which to me is very George. He vacillates between a lot of feelings. He's very dramatic and over the top, which is also what his family's like. You can make an argument that, well, when people grow up in loud households, the only way you can be heard, if you're heard at all, is to also be loud. So you can, like I said, it goes back to this idea when you work with someone like George, you have to take all these things into consideration. Like, is he that over the top because his parents were over the top and the only way you could be heard in your household was to be over the top, which isn't as common in small families like his, where there's only one kid. You see that more. Yeah. Well, at least I've seen that more when I've worked with families that are a lot bigger.
Yeah.
And then use the sexuality to gain attention. I don't know. I really see that with George, other than he will use attention to get sex from women.
Have you seen his painting?
Oh, his painting. That is also the assumption that those sexy photos are for him. That's where he does have like that sort of like narcissistic flavor.
Yeah, a little bit.
He will jump to a conclusion.
Yeah, he loves jumping to conclusions. He really does.
But yeah, but other borderline things is, well, I mean, it's also hard because a lot of things are found to be true. Like assuming that everyone, not borderline personality disorder is what I mean, is like assuming that everyone at that foundation board is talking about him when he leaves the room. So then he leaves that suitcase so that he can record them talking about him. Like he is very up his own ass in a lot of ways. Like he does have also that sort of like paranoia, which I do see when I work with people who have personality disorders. I think what's interesting to point out with that is when we hear the word paranoia, I think we typically think of it more in the context of like psychosis, like assuming people are following me or someone's calling my house. And when I have seen it in clients that I've worked with personality disorders, it's more like a softer kind of paranoia of like everyone is talking about me behind my back. Nobody likes me. It's a subtler version of paranoia that people don't really assign as paranoia. But that is a trait that when you do like personality disorder assessments, paranoia is one of the traits that gets measured. But yeah, he has that too. Like he's got a flavor of a few cluster Bs going on. We could argue that the human fun thing is a bit antisocial. The way he talks about being a philanthropist is a little off. Like I want people to get on their knees and beg for my help, and then
they would owe me, and then they'll owe me big time. That's what he says.
Like
and then they'll
the
owe me big
opposite
time
of being a philanthropist.
Yeah, that would be more narcissistic.
Yeah, but so he does show traits that kind of travel through these different cluster B diagnoses. And also, like I said, a part of me is curious just how he's so impulsive. He makes these choices. Like you said it earlier, Hannah, he's so short-sighted. Like all the things that he does over the course of the show, so many of them are just like, how can I feel good right now? Or how can I get out of this situation right now? Which you could argue too is if you grow up in a traumatic household where there's constant punishment and there's no room for forgiveness. Of course, you could argue that his short-sightedness is also a trauma reaction. He's just trying not to be in trouble, which is very young, but also would make sense.
It always makes sense. Human beings have a basic instinct to avoid pain. All animals do. And contrary to what people think about traumatized reactions is that we don't respond to pain any differently if it's physical pain or emotional pain. The same instinct to get out of it applies. And the same basic reactions to escape, avoid, delay, or fight that pain show up. And that doesn't matter at all whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, perceived or real. It doesn't matter. If pain is there, the nervous system's going to respond to defeat it one way or another, period. So understanding that just because someone's not going to likely be dragged across saw blades doesn't mean you're not going to get a really strong reaction from them if they believe they're going to get hurt. And that will be a impulsive decision if the threat is strong enough. Whenever it crosses a certain threshold, the ability to logically respond decreases, and the more the limbic system takes over, the more we get a animalistic response. It's just the way things are. And unfortunately in society, we teach this mind over matter mentality as if it's true. And it's only true if you're calm. If you are not calm, if you perceive threat, your system that is designed to defeat threats, whether you are paying attention or ready for one or not, kicks on, and it is involuntary. So George compulsively doing all these things almost always is based off him perceiving a threat.
And that the consequences are not necessarily intolerable, but are to be avoided at all costs.
They're intolerable to George.
And not thinking about how you're creating a potential worse consequence, because that's part of him being in survival, right? He's just thinking of the threat currently in front of him. Not the threat 3 doors down. That would be a chain reaction from this choice.
I think he does think about that. I think George, like most people, thinks about and magnifies it. George spends a lot of time sitting and like talking about how this will become this and this will become that and that'll become that. A lot of those scenes in the show where George is continually ramping himself up and his voice gets higher are George doing internal time traveling, as I like to call it, where he is going into past and future simultaneously, mining for resources in his past, probably because of Frank, and then launching into what could go wrong now and how that'll build into whatever fantasy he's concocted. And it's usually 10,000 of them simultaneously. And the downside of our body being so apt at imagination and the ability to go into the matrix and view all these things is that you have neurological capability of doing this, but your neurology, meaning nerves, is all wired to one body. So you perceive 10,000 realities, all of them in which you're in conditions of danger to varying degrees. Well, guess what? Your nervous system is going to be sending signals to your body to survive.
I guess I more mean that he gets hooked into the human fun thing. He does not think about the fact that at some point, somebody, the accountant, is going to check into that and find out that it's bullshit, right? Like that he does these things. I think out of anxiety, he can definitely project forward and like what if and catastrophize and stuff. But in these things where he gets caught in the moment and could potentially get in trouble, or if there's like a big reward, he seems to have trouble thinking ahead.
Well, that's
or
sure,
thinking to like the logical conclusion. I mean, that's part of the shenanigans that is the show, right? Shows like this are built on shenanigans. But like even like the play now thing, like he does so much stuff in the moment just because he wants to keep getting what he's getting or not getting what he could get consequence wise, not thinking about the long term consequences or even like the consequences 2 consequences away. Well, that's what I was responding to.
Yeah, that's a separate argument though. That's like you're talking about threat response versus trying to fill a need if your child self is engaged. Like if you find a deficit, it's a need deficit, trying to fill a hole from childhood, like George not getting attention and being subject to a narcissistic father, there's likely a great deal of needs not being met for his child self. When that kicks online, like Christmas would be a particular trigger for that. An old need shows up, like he's expecting to get presents and kind of come out ahead, which is very childish. Like kids think Christmas is about getting gifts. Adults know it's about being together and giving gifts that make other people happy.
Yeah, and that he has this regressive behavior with that, and then also just not wanting to get in trouble.
Right. But George doesn't care about getting in trouble till he gets in trouble. Like he's not giving out the human fun things isn't about avoiding trouble. That's about him pulling one over and coming out ahead and winning for once. That's selfishness and short-sightedness. I accept the child argument, but the survival part of it doesn't kick in until Kruger catches him, and then he like drops his head and gives the check back. But prior to that, he's thinking about starting his own charity. Like, is he short-sighted? Yes. Is that under threat? I don't think so, because he's ignoring Jerry's warnings that he could get caught. Like,
that's true.
Yeah.
It's not until he actually gets caught that we see him realize how between a rock and a hard place he is, and that now he has to submit and put his tail between his legs, and there's no coming back in the episode for George. I don't know that he says another word other than ugh.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So is there anything else we want to say about George specifically before we take a break? All right. So we're going to skip treatment this episode. 1, because this is sort of a mini Christmas episode. And then 2, because I don't know, we kind of collectively don't know if anyone on this show would go to treatment or would comply with treatment. Because when you are coming from an egocentric, narcissistic stance, treatment is really difficult. Some professionals would argue it's impossible. I don't ever want to say it's impossible for someone to engage in therapy and to progress. I always have to leave at least a small window open for that. But for someone, I mean, everyone on the show does not really, they can sort of name what's quote unquote wrong with them at times, but they really don't seem to have a big problem with who they are and how they're engaging in the world. They don't take any real ownership of themselves, and therefore, why would they change?
Well, and even in the last episode, when they get busted for failing to abide by the Good Samaritan law, they still don't take accountability.
Yeah.
I think for me, like speaking for myself in those discussions, it's not a maybe. I don't think these characters, as we saw them for 9 seasons of this show, would remotely benefit from therapy as they've been shown.
Yeah. I mean, Jerry doesn't even think he has feelings. Remember the episode where he cries and he doesn't even know what's happening? What is this salty discharge?
What is this salty discharge coming out of my eyes?
He's like, I think I'm having feelings or whatever he says.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're not in touch with that stuff that you need to fully engage in therapy.
No, I think the only person who, I can't even remember her name, but the people who need group therapy are the people who've dated Jerry.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's
Yeah.
many names for those women. All the people in
Yeah.
the last episode of the show could do a support group about how they have
Yes.
been collectively harmed by the people on the show,
Mhm.
by the main characters.
Yeah.
So I guess we will go to final thoughts then, which feels weird to say because final thoughts about Seinfeld is like, babe, either you like Seinfeld or you're not cool. I don't know what else to tell you. Like, that's the final thoughts on Seinfeld. I mean, I love it. I think I'm about to say it just to be spicy. I think it's way better than Friends, but I will concede that you can be a Friends person or a Seinfeld person. I know a lot of people that are both. I'm a Seinfeld girl. I love Seinfeld. I'll watch it forever. It makes me tee hee hee every time I watch it. It's one of my favorite things.
I mean, this episode is an all-time classic of TV. I think it's a masterpiece in writing and performance, and I love the way they allow the consequences of their actions to come for them in this last season of the show, where the early seasons didn't kind of go that way. But this
Yeah.
last season, the real theme of it was like building up to like the consequences of your actions will come for you. Karma is real and it's a bitch.
Mm-hmm.
Like Elaine getting a fake number at the end of the show, Kramer getting fired from the job he keeps going on strike from, even though it's been ridiculous
God,
amounts
that
of time for a
gum,
bagel shop. Oh,
the
it's gross.
gum in the dough. He's so gross.
He's so gross.
And looking at like, all-time comedies, Seinfeld is definitely one of them.
Mhm.
It's amazing. I think neither Seinfeld nor Friends will age well. Friends is definitely not aged well. There's a lot of things in there that aren't great. And Seinfeld, well, the cell phone essentially kills 90% of the episodes.
I think so. There's a person who does modern Seinfeld. I don't
Oh,
remember
yeah.
what platform it's on, but he talks about how they would talk about dating apps, texting, rules around texting, like
Mhm.
hookup culture, and it works.
Oh,
And it feels like it's in the voice of them. So I think even if the cell phones would just add another layer to their neuroses.
I'm saying that they, as the show is, not that the show couldn't exist with cell phones. The writing could write its way around anything. That's the point of the show. It's just life. But what I think is going to happen, much like has happened to a lot of great comedies, is that because it's so much a period of its time, that kids that grow up with an entire generation of smartphones are going to watch this show and not resonate with it at all. It's not going to be one of the ones where people go back many years and watch it, because the premise of it would be so defeated by the internet and cell phones that people are like, why wouldn't they just text them or call them, when so many episodes are like somebody's lost or somebody's not there, or they don't know where they are, should they keep waiting for them, like all those things. I think what we will see is that, much like some of the shows that our parents liked that are objectively great comedies, are totally lost on us because we didn't live those times. And I think, unfortunately, Seinfeld will go that way, even though for those of us that were alive during the times, we watch it and go, it was like that. And now kids that, like, as they grow up, I think won't find this and look back on it and resonate and laugh. But for those of us that were alive anywhere during the 80s, 90s, this show is glorious.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this show. I watched it while it was on regular TV. And one of my favorite things as a senior in high school was we would watch the episode. I'd watch the episode on Thursday night, and then the next day on Friday at lunch, me and my two friends, Jack and Ryan, would just like relive the episode together, and we would chat about it. And it was really fun and a really cool way to connect to different kinds of people. So I love this show. I'll always love this show. I don't disagree. I think it ages way better than Friends. I think Friends is trash.
Agreed.
I think it ages a lot better, but I definitely agree with what you're saying. Like, I don't know that a young person could like watch the first episode and be connected to it in the way that I am. Like, I just don't think that that's a possibility. Because there's things that just don't make any sense anymore.
Right.
In the storyline. But when you grew up in a time without cell phones and without the internet, like, the show made a lot of sense. And so, yeah, but I love it and I'll always love it and I always laugh at it and I quote from it way too much.
Mm-hmm.
It's glorious. It has it everywhere. But I think, man, the best example I can give is the number of people that are maybe 10 to 15 years older than us that love the WKRP in Cincinnati, like turkey drop episode, which is really funny. But I don't think it hits us the same way because radio hosts just didn't have any gravitas for us by our generation. We were like, yeah, I don't care.
Not Elvis
I don't
Duran?
know. I don't know. I watched that show, and that show made me laugh. I know I'm older than everybody here. But that show did make me laugh, and because I grew up listening to the radio. So it actually, like, knowing the hosts, and it was a thing. So yeah, I guess what I'm really saying is that I'm older than everyone, and I still.
Well, I used to listen. Hey, I listened to Loveline religiously.
Yeah, I did too.
In high school. So, but that's of its time. That's podcast now. You know what you're listening to right now. I will say, if someone just happens to be listening to this episode and you've never seen Seinfeld before, especially if you're a younger person, don't start with season 1 because there's no Elaine in the first few episodes. Start at like season 3 or 4 and you won't feel lost because it's very much one of those shows where you don't really need to know any history to enjoy what you're watching. Each episode can kind of be watched in a vacuum for the most part, with the exception of like the series finale.
Yeah, this is a comedy when comedies were just, this is the episode. There's no overarching storyline or plot.
Yeah. Which is also different than Friends, where you kind of have to know who's dating who and who fucked over who and who went on a break but didn't go on a break. And and something we had said before we recorded, like last week, I think actually, is that the reason why we do think like, well, Hannah and I agree that like Seinfeld will age better than Friends. I know a lot of people love Friends. I'm not trying to be, well, I am always trying to be a Friends hater. I don't know why. I just try to act like I wouldn't. Is that on Friends, you're supposed to like them. And on Seinfeld, you're not supposed to like them. You're supposed to think they're funny, like cartoons, like same with It's Always Sunny, but you're not supposed to like them. So I think what's hard when I watch Friends now is I'm like, I'm supposed to like these motherfuckers. They suck. They do suck. Just to give some further, like, just explaining a little bit about why I and Hannah have that opinion. I know it's controversial, potentially, because I know that
I don't give a shit that it's controversial.
Friends is having like a renaissance with the younger people. Also, the 90s fashions are back, which you could argue like chicken or the egg in terms of like what influenced what. The Rachel haircut's back. It's just
time.
Back.
It's just time for it to come back. That's why.
Yeah.
It's time.
But anywho.
Vintage is a 20-year cycle.
Yeah. But happy Festivus to you all. And happy whatever holiday you celebrate. Whether that's Festivus, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Christmas, secular cultures.
Winter solstice.
Winter solstice. Oh, yeah, winter solstice. Happy winter solstice to you all. Specifically,
hopefully you
our
can
friend
have
Sarah.
a non-secular gift exchange not involving Santa.
Exactly. Well, on that note, have a happy Festivus, y'all. Get out that, metal pole and wrestle your beloved loved ones for dominance.